Good evening, friends. Welcome to my channel. So today we are going to discuss about a very important fascia. Before going to discuss about it, please subscribe to my channel. So today's topic is thoraco-lumbar fascia. So this thoraco-lumbar fascia, which is a fascia of posterior abdominal wall, and this thoraco-lumbar fascia has been named in 1615 by a scientist called as Crook. The thoraco-lumbar fascia in the lumbar region is in three layers. The posterior layer is attached to the spines of lumbar and sacral vertebrae, and to the supraspinous ligament. So what about these three layers and their attachments? So the anterior layer, it is going to thicken above, and it forms a ligament called as lateral arcuate ligament. So in the screen you can identify over here. So this ligament has been formed by anterior layer of thoracolumbar fascia, and below, which is extending down and reaches to the posterior part of iliac crest, and it is thickened to form iliolumbar ligament. Then after that, medially. So what is going to happen medially is, it is going to attach to the vertical ridges of anterior surfaces of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. So when you just look at the lumbar vertebrae, the parts of the lumbar vertebrae are two transverse processes, and posteriorly we can identify the spinous process. So this anterior layer of thoracolumbar fascia, which is extending medially, and it is attaches to the vertical ridges which which the lumbar vertebrae transverse process, they are having that vertical ridges. To that vertical ridges, this anterior layer of thoracolumbar fascia is attaching. Here in this picture you can identify clearly how the anterior layer is extending medially and attaches to the vertical ridges of transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. And lateral attachment. So lateral attachment of the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, which is extending laterally and blends with the lumbar fascia. And from this fascia, the two muscles which are rising, inside is the transverse abdominis, then outside to the transverse abdominis you can identify the internal oblique abdominis. These inside two muscles which are arising from the anterior layer, strictly speaking the lateral extension of the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. Then moving to the middle layer. So the middle layer, which is attached to the 12th rib laterally, and transverse process of the first lumbar vertebrae. Let me show you the picture. In the next picture, I'm going to show that. And this middle layer, which is present behind the Quadratus Lumborum muscle. And it is forming a ligament called as Lumbosacral ligament. Yeah, here you can identify in this picture. In the first picture, you can identify this is the vertical muscle fibers or nothing but the Quadratus Lumborum, and behind that you can identify the middle layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. So this thoracolumbar fascia, medially, it is attaches to the tips of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, whereas to the anterior surface of the lumbar vertebrae, the anterior layer is fusing, and the tips of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, the middle layer is fusing. So between the anterior layer and the middle layer, this Quadratus Lumborum is present. Yeah, in this picture, you can clearly figure out. Yeah, here you can see the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, and what is going to happen to the middle layer medial extension. So middle layer medially, it is attaches to the tips of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, and below it is forming the iliolumbar ligament along with the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. So in this picture, you can identify this is the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, and this is the middle layer of thoracolumbar fascia. Between these two layers, you can identify this is nothing but the Quadratus Lumborum muscle. So as we have discussed earlier, inferior it is forming the iliolumbar ligament. Then attachments of the posterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. So attachments of the posterior layer, So the posterior layer which is extending behind and it is reaching to the spinous process of the lumbar vertebrae. Spinous process of the lumbar vertebrae. So below this posterior layer, below extension is, it is extending up to the posterior part of the iliac crest, and above it extends as the thoracic part of thoraco-lumbar fascia. Thoracic part of thoraco-lumbar fascia. Yes, here in this picture, I'm just showing you from posterior aspect. So this is representing the posterior layer of the thoraco-lumbar fascia. Medially it is fusing to the spinous process of the lumbar vertebrae, and then laterally, lateral which is extending lateral and fuses with the lumbar fascia. The next fascia which we are going to discuss about, the fascia iliaca. Fascia iliaca. So this fascia iliaca, it is have an osteofascial pocket. We can also call it as osteofascial pocket. So this fascia iliaca, it is having two parts, iliac part and also the psoas part. So the psoas part is a fascia which is covering the muscle called as psoas major muscle. Psoas major muscle. And the psoas major muscle, which is arising from the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae and from the intervertebral discs of the lumbar vertebrae, and it is covered by the fascia called as psoas part of psoas iliaca, fascia iliaca. And above, it is going to thicken and forms the medial arcuate ligament. So the lateral arcuate ligament has been formed by the thickening of the thoracolumbar fascia. Medial arcuate ligament is formed by the fascia iliaca, thickening of the uh, fascia iliaca. And then laterally it blends with the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. So in this picture, you can identify clearly this is nothing but the psoas major muscle, which is arising from the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae and from the transverse process, anterior surface of the transverse process of lumbar vertebrae, and it is covered by this fascia iliaca. And laterally, it is joining with the anterior layer of thoracolumbar fascia. So that is the extension of the fascia iliaca. Medially, what is going to happen medially? So medially, it is attached to the bodies of lumbar vertebrae and intervening intervertebral discs of the lumbar vertebrae and presents four tendinous arches. So below this fascia iliaca, it fuses with the arcuate line of the pelvis, and the fascia covering the iliacus muscle, which is arising from the iliac surface or from the greater pelvis. From the greater pelvis, in the inner surface, we can identify the iliacus is arising. So this psoas part is joining with the iliacus part of the fascia iliaca, and this fascia is attaching to the arcuate line or linea terminalis, which is separating the bony pelvis into false pelvis above, true pelvis below. Also, we can call it as greater pelvis above, the lesser pelvis below. So what about these applied aspects of the fascia iliaca? So the psoas abscess, or we can call it as psoas fascia, is the psoas abscess which is caused by the infections of the tuberculosis. During tuberculosis infections, the Mycobacterium tubercle bacteria, it can break down the walls of the bronchopulmonary segments, and this abscess and this infectious fluid, it extends outside from inside the lung and enters into the costodiaphragmatic recess of the pleura, and then that fluid, it can pass through the posterior part of the abdominal wall and enters into the abdomen and reaches to below the fascia iliaca, and then it extends down and reaches to the bony pelvis region, and sometimes it may extends into the medial, it extends into the thigh, as the fascia iliaca is forming the posterior layer or contributing the formation of the posterior layer of the femoral sheath. It enters into the thigh, and it may enters into the knee region, or sometimes it reaches to the heel region also. So that is about the psoas abscess. Then moving to the muscles of the posterior abdominal wall. So the first and foremost muscle is the psoas major muscle. So this psoas major muscle origin it is arising from the anterior surface of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. anterior surface of transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. The five slips, they arises from the anterior surface of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, and other five slips which are arising from the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae, and also they are also arising from the intervertebral discs which are present between the lumbar vertebrae. So this is the origin of the lumbar vertebrae, origin of the psoas major. Yes. So in our previous part, we have seen the origins of the psoas major muscle, and we can identify the tendinous bands which we can identify between the origin of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae and the origin of the psoas major from the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae. So between these two particular different origins, we can identify the tendinous bands. These are the tendinous bands or tendinous intersections we can identify. So coming to the insertion of the psoas major, we have seen the origin of it. So from the transverse process and the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae it is arising, and it is descending down. It is running anterior to the ala of the sacrum. So ala is nothing but the a butterfly wing shape, a part of the sacrum, and then it is descends down and enters into the pelvis, and it is joining with the iliacus muscle. Together, these two muscles forming a common tendon, this common tendon which is running behind the inguinal ligament. Here in this green color, I am representing the inguinal ligament. Inguinal ligament is represented in this green color, and behind this inguinal ligament, this psoas major and the iliacus together they forms a common tendon and runs down and reaches to the lesser trochanter femur that it is getting inserted to it. Okay, so that is the origin and insertion of the psoas major. And here you can see in this picture how these two muscles are joining and forming a common tendon over here, and this common tendon is getting inserted to the lesser trochanter femur. Then what about the nerve supply of this psoas major? Psoas major is supplied by ventral rami of second and third lumbar nerves directly from the lumbar plexus. Actions of it. What are the actions of the psoas major? So acting from above, it is a chief flexor of the thigh. So in this picture, you can identify there is a chief flexor of the thigh. So you can see the movement of this flexion. The flexion is caused by this psoas major muscle. And when the foot is on the ground, the psoas major acts as a medial rotator. When the foot is above the ground level, it acts as the lateral rotator of hip joint. So in this picture, you can identify the medial rotation is caused by the psoas major when the foot is on the ground. When the foot is above the ground, it is acting as a lateral rotator of hip joint. Then the relations of the psoas major. So the relations are the psoas major is a key muscle of posterior abdominal wall because its relations provide a fair idea about the layout of the structures in this region. So the lumbar plexus forms within the substance of the psoas major. So all the lumbar plexus they are coming through this psoas major. So when you're dissecting the lumbar plexus, better not to cut the psoas major and search for the lumbar plexus. You may not find that because you may cut the nerves. So the plexus can be displayed only by tearing the muscle, for it does not divide the muscle into planes. So the five nerves emerge from underneath the lateral border of the psoas major: subcoastal nerve, iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh, and femoral nerve. Let us see all the five structures. So in this picture, you can identify this subcoastal nerve, iliohypogastric over here, ilioinguinal, then this is the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and here you can identify the femoral nerve. So from above downwards, subcoastal, iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and the femoral nerve. So these are all the five nerves which are coming from the behind the psoas major only, behind psoas major. Subcoastal, iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and the femoral nerve. Then moving to the important triangle called as lumbosacral triangle of Marcelli. So what is this lumbosacral triangle of Marcelli? So it's a triangular interval on each side of the L5 vertebrae. Can you find this L5 vertebrae over here? On each side of the lumbar vertebrae, you can identify the triangular shaped interval, and apex is directed upwards. Apex is directed upwards, and the base is formed. Base is formed by base is formed by the ala of the sacrum. Base is formed by the ala of the sacrum, and then lateral boundary of it is formed by the medial border of the psoas major muscle. In this picture, you can identify this lumbosacral triangle of Marcellus over here. So it is present lateral to the lumbar vertebrae and medial to the psoas major muscle. So here you can identify the triangular shaped interval which is present on either side of the fifth lumbar vertebrae. So here you can see the apex is formed by the junction of psoas major and the body of the lumbar vertebrae, fifth lumbar vertebrae. And the floor, what about the floor? Floor or posterior wall is formed by transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, transverse process of fifth lumbar vertebrae, and the iliolumbar ligament, which is a thickening of the anterior layer of the thoraco-lumbar fascia. So what is it contains? This lumbosacral triangle of Marcellus it is containing four important structures: obturator, iliolumbar artery, lumbosacral trunk, and sympathetic trunk. So to remember these four contents in the lumbosacral triangle of Marcellus is OILS, O-I-L-S. O stands for obturator nerve, I stands for iliolumbar artery, L stands for lumbosacral trunk, and S stands for sympathetic trunk. So the schematic diagram, and you can easily represent in the examination. So next muscle is Quadratus Lumborum. So this is a quadrilateral muscle which fills the medial half of the gap between the 12th rib and the iliac crest. 12th rib and the iliac crest. So on the tips of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. So this Quadratus lumborum, it is filling the gap between the lower part of the ribs or thoracic cage and the above the iliac crest. So this Quadratus lumborum present lateral to the psoas major muscle, and it is covered by the two layers of the thoracolumbar fascia. One is anterior layer and the middle layer. So between anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia and the middle layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, this Quadratus lumborum is present. So in this transverse section diagram, we can identify clearly. So this is the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, which is attaching to the anterior surface of transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, and then the middle layer, which is attaching to the tips of the transverse process of lumbar vertebrae. So between these two layers, we can identify the Quadratus lumborum over here. So what is the origin of the Quadratus lumborum? So Quadratus lumborum, it is arising from the posterior one-third of the inner lip of iliac crest, and the iliolumbar ligament. The insertion is it is extending upwards, and medially, then it is passing posterior to the lateral arcuate ligament, then it is inserted to the medial part of the anterior surface of the 12th rib. Okay, easily you can remember that. Origin is from the iliac crest and the iliolumbar ligament, and insertion is extending up, it is reaching to the 12th rib, anterior surface of the 12th rib. Okay, so medially it is getting inserted. So it is also inserted to the upper lumbar transverse process, upper part of the lumbar transverse process, posterior to the slips of origin. So this is the insertion of Quadratus lumborum muscle. Then what is the nerve supply of it? So nerve supply is supplied by ventral rami of T12 to L3 and L4 lumbar spinal nerves. The action is, it is a lateral flexor of the lumbar vertebral column. So in this picture, in this image, we can identify the person is flexing his body laterally. So this Quadratus lumborum unilateral action means one side Quadratus lumborum contracts in the lateral flexion movement. Lateral flexion movement. So backward extension, it is caused by both sides quadratus lumborum contraction. Okay, both sides means right and left quadratus lumborum action that contracts in the extension of the full extension of the body. So unilateral or single flexion of the body, it is caused by the contraction of quadratus lumborum of one side. So in this picture you can identify is a lateral flexion. It is caused by the one side quadratus lumborum contraction. The relations. What about the relations? So the relations of the quadratus lumborum anterior to the quadratus lumborum. This is the fascia which is present here is nothing but anterior layer of the thoraco-lumbar fascia. As in front of this anterior layer of the thoraco-lumbar fascia, we can identify this yellow color structure is nothing but the paranephric fat or pararenal fat. Then in front of the pararenal fat, we can identify the posterior layer of the renal fascia. It is also called as Zucker-Candle fascia. And in front of the posterior layer of the renal fascia, we can identify another layer of fat. This fat is called as perirenal fat. Then inside, in front of this perirenal fat, we can identify the renal capsule and the posterior surface of the kidney. So these are the anterior relations of the quadratus lumborum muscle. So this is the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, pararenal fat, posterior layer of the renal fascia, perirenal fat. Then other relations. So the fourth lumbar, lower part in front of the quadratus lumborum, the lower part, we can identify the fourth lumbar artery which is running anterior to the quadratus lumborum, whereas first, second, third lumbar arteries which are running behind the quadratus lumborum, but this fourth lumbar artery running anterior to the quadratus lumborum. Then the nerves which are present anterior to that are the subcoastal, iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, and the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. So these are the four nerves we have seen, which are the lateral boundary contents of the psoas major, whereas these four nerves, same nerves which are running anterior to the quadratus lumborum muscle. So fourth lumbar artery. Then what is present behind? Behind the quadratus lumborum, we can identify first, second, third lumbar arteries. First, second, third lumbar arteries running behind the quadratus lumborum muscle. So medially, so what is present medially? So medially, we can identify the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, which is fusing with the anterior surface of the transverse process of lumbar vertebrae, where it is going to join with the lateral margin of the fascia iliaca. Laterally, what is going to form laterally? So laterally, we can identify the fusion of the anterior layer and the middle layers of the thoracolumbar fascia, and from that we can identify the two muscles which are arising. One is transverse abdominis inside, internal oblique abdominis outside to the transverse abdominis. So this is about the muscles, fasciae, nerves of the posterior abdominal wall. Thank you, dear students. See you soon with the new class. Thank you.